So on to our featured project. So I mentioned Florida Community Innovation. That's the nonprofit where I spend a lot of my time when I'm not doing SciStarter things. You can learn more about us at floridainnovation.org. So FCI, I mentioned, has over 50 student and youth innovators building social services technologies, doing research and doing community service just to make Florida a better place. And our flagship project is the Florida Community Resource Map, which is poised to connect people to food banks, job resources, and more. And we have this project called GoBituary, which I'm going to give you some background on. The students at FCI, we have a critical mass of people in Gainesville, Florida, a lot of engagement from the University of Florida. But we also have student teams from Georgetown and the University of Michigan. And Anna Lanzino, who came up with the idea for the GoBituary project, that this citizen science project assists, she's actually based at UC Berkeley, but she is a lifelong Floridian as well, and I know is very excited to work on Florida issues with this project. But I don't think we have anybody else from Florida on the line. We have people tuning in from Egypt for the live event, people from Iowa, for example. Hopefully what you learn about in this event, you could volunteer if you'd like and write histories about the Miami City Cemetery. Or you could advocate for us to bring GoBituary to your community potentially. Anna, who started this project, there have been a number of other students and volunteers who have written the histories, who have done community outreach, who have helped get grants to support this project. It's a very interdisciplinary team with software students, software engineer volunteers, some art history students in the mix, students of all backgrounds, people of all backgrounds who have come together to develop this project. And this project wouldn't be possible without support from the Florida Humanities Council. So I definitely wanted to make a point to thank them for supporting our students and our community partners as well. Okay, so what is the Miami City Cemetery? So it is one of the oldest cemeteries in the Southeast. A lot of really interesting people are buried there. So one thing that makes it special, so this is the, for those of you who are watching live, this is the entrance to the cemetery, and to the side of it is a piece of graffiti I saw the last time I visited right next to the gate. The Miami City Cemetery, a number of people of different racial backgrounds are buried there, a number of people who helped create Miami are buried there. So it's an interfaith, interracial cemetery, which is very special and interesting for a cemetery this historic in the Southeast. But there are a lot of interesting stories here. One thing that struck me about this cemetery, and one reason Anna and I were so inspired to create this project, is this cemetery is in particular at risk of climate change. So when you visit it, sometimes you can, feel the water in the ground. The sea levels in Miami are rising. So this is definitely a historic landmark at risk. But when you're there, you can really feel the beauty of it. And a number of people will have historians like Paul George. He's a historian who's worked with us as we developed this project. He does a number of tours in the cemetery. But one reason we were inspired to do this is in Florida, our state doesn't necessarily have a state identity. Researchers have published on this. People in Florida don't necessarily feel very connected to their state or to the history of their state. But other social science researchers have found that people feel more connected to their community after historical education. So we thought, okay, we have this historic landmark with a lot of really interesting people buried here. We have a state and a city that doesn't necessarily have an identity per se. What if we educated people about the past and helped connect them to the present? And maybe make them more civically engaged in Miami and Florida generally. So to that end, Anna came up with the GoBituary project, and one of our volunteers, Nico, came up with the name GoBituary, like an obituary, but on the go. And we started developing it and getting a student team together. So there are, Alexander Lightburn is one person who's buried at the cemetery. He is an African-American founder of Miami. He's listed among the city incorporators. People have written about him. And when you visit the cemetery, you can see this tombstone, but his past is so rich. There's so much more to learn about him. He's so inspiring that we started having our students at FCI, the undergraduates, write histories about noteworthy individuals like Alexander Lightburn. The Peacock grave is there. We wrote about the Peacock family in the GoBituary project. So we could just have that human element there, take history down to the level of individual lives. And then the GoBituary project, the web app that we're developing, and that's soon to be released. So sign up for the FCI newsletter if you want to be in the loop about when the web app is live, and when you can dive into the launch event if you happen to be in the Miami area this fall. We're going to have a launch event at the cemetery. You can also take quizzes and enrich your understanding about each history that you explore. And Anna and her team have done such a great job making the web app engaging. She's built it alongside the FCI students and volunteers, and they've also written engaging histories about some of the luminaries who are buried at the cemetery. And so that's we have an example of the web app up on the screen of Julia Tuttle, the mother of Miami. She's one of the people featured in this, the GoBituary app. And like we mentioned, Alexander Lightbourne, one of the Miami founders and a civic leader, he's featured there as well. But there are a number of other people buried at the cemetery who we haven't written histories about yet. Because for our launch, we focused on some of the keynote people, but we thought, there are some people like just wandering around the cemetery, you see really interesting tombstones. Some of them have special symbols on them. They're really inspiring quotes. So for example, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. Real poetry there are. Here's one on the right side of my screen. Love is strong as death, meet me there. I think there's a lot more to dive into. And when we were speaking to Paul George, the historian who's mentored us with this project, he mentioned that in many of these communities, oral histories survive of people who were noteworthy in the community, but maybe their histories weren't written down. Or there are some people who, there are about 10 new burials a year. So there are many relatives of people buried in the cemetery who might have interesting stories to tell. Or there's archival evidence, right? And like old newspapers and microfilm that may not have made it onto the internet in a big way, but we could retell it. So we thought, let's do a social citizen science project and do some crowdsourcing here and then open it up to you all, the public. We have a list of everybody buried in the cemetery, the people who we haven't written histories about yet. And we have a model history about how you can write about Julia Tuttle's the model history we provided. And we invite you to pick a name and do some research, see what's out there about them on the internet, maybe meet with a librarian in the Miami area and learn about that person. Just all the ways that we research these people, right? In terms of looking at archival sources. And we want you to do your best to tell a lively story. Cite your sources, of course, and we have simple citations because it's not, a journal article. This is more of a public crowdsourced resource. We encourage you to put your personality into the stories, just like we did with the Julia Tuttle, maybe even add some editorial feedback. But you can also, say where you're getting particular facts from. And we have examples about how to do that. And we provided all of that through Anecdata. So Anecdata is a free platform where we set up a form where the prompt is just really simple. We have the list of names of the people buried there. And then you can just start Googling. Google Scholar is a great resource. Old newspapers like the Miami Herald, just all the different techniques that you do when you want to find out about someone, maybe get a genealogy librarian to help you. And then you can submit the history draft whenever you're done. And over the next year or so, we'll be going through these. And for the Miami City Cemetery, adding them to the GoBituary project. But if you, once again, as we mentioned earlier, we'd love to spread it around the country. So if you really want to have a GoBituary in your community, let us know, be in touch, and we can definitely do that. So that's the basic Cliff's Notes of the project. We brought Bob on. He hosts our podcast. I just want to see, Bob, you've learned a little bit about this project. It's kind of a unique crowdsourcing effort that builds on what Anna Lanzino and her team made for the Miami City Cemetery in terms of the historical luminaries. Do you have any questions that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is, well, a couple. So you have a list of everyone that's buried in this particular cemetery.
Yep.
And I or anyone can go online and get that list. And then is there anything in particular beyond that? I guess we just find a name and then just go searching however we want. And then once we do that, is there any form you want it in? Is it first person, like, hi, my name's Elmira, let me tell you my story? Or is it, this is the story of, or is it scholarly? Is it, what kind of, what more than telling the story do you want?
Yeah, we gave the example history from Julia Tuttle.
Uh-huh.
And that, so it's written, like a history. We're not pretending to be her, as fun as that would be.
Okay.
But it would be Julia Tuttle was blah 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 blah. But you'll see in the sample history, like you can add a little bit of personality. Like it's not a stodgy, boring, journal article. It's a real history that's meant to, like a story you would tell around a campfire. Like Julia Tuttle was born here, but albeit with citations. And actually, you mentioned the list of people from the cemetery. Anna, if you don't mind chiming in, because I know you've digitized the bulk of those. Do you want to talk about what that process was like?
Yeah, so basically the cemetery gave us their records for everyone who they have buried there, and those records were not digitized. They were in a very long list, stuffed into a binder that Caroline very graciously went and took pictures of every single page. I think there were probably at least 100 pages, and I don't even think we got everybody. So for that process, though, Nico, another volunteer, and I started to digitize everyone, just putting them each in their own, Excel row. And FCI also hosted a like a crowdsourced event so that we could all work on it together. But yeah, so we've got plenty of people for you all to research, which is awesome.
And we kept it pretty open-ended on purpose because this is a non-traditional project, where if you want to interview people and like have some of the oral histories, as long as you cite personal conversation with X person, you can include that. We're encouraging people to scan old newspapers, old records. We don't want to be overly prescriptive with how you research the particular people. Maybe Anna, since I know you've written many of the histories and supervised the undergrads writing the other ones, do you want to talk about what the process of writing a history was like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it was a learning curve because I hadn't used a lot of the different like libraries and archival resources before. But I think something that I found helpful is going especially to a lot of the local universities, library databases like Florida International University, University of Miami. Those were kind of, and the University of Florida too. Those were really helpful. Also just doing Google searches. And there are already some really great organizations in Miami that have discussed some of the more like well-covered people in this cemetery, but there are certainly some that we haven't looked at yet. So yeah, I would say look around at all the different organizations and universities, and that has been for me the most helpful thing.
Yeah, I think honestly, if you're interested in participating in this, no matter where you are in the world, if you're in Egypt and you want to dive into the very fascinating history of Miami, Florida, which I'm not biased, but I think is one of the most interesting cities in the world, you could just book a Zoom meeting with a librarian at the University of Miami Library. Are there genealogy librarians in the public library system in Miami? And they'll have plenty of ideas about sources you can use too. And like Anna mentioned, the university sources are a great place to start. But yeah, that was what the process was like. One thing I wanted to point out about the tombstones is I think if you are able to come in person and participate in this project, the tombstones themselves, I think, could be a pretty rich source of data you could include in your history. So you see the 3 chains linked here. Apparently that means that it was a fraternal order that I don't think exists anymore, but people would put things like that to show that they were part of certain organizations. Or people would give interesting information about their life. I saw one woman who was buried relatively early, but she was listed on her tombstone as a PhD. So the fact that she was a woman and she had a PhD in the 1880s, I think says a lot. So that's another interesting data source and a way you could dive in. But Bob, have you ever been to Miami? I'm curious.
Yeah, no, I went to the University of Miami, so
Oh,
I
I
lived there
forgot
for a
that.
while. Yeah. I don't think I've been to this cemetery though, but I'm curious whether Grave, the grave rubbings that people do where you get like tracing paper and you run a charcoal thing over it and you make an imprint of the gravestone. Whether that's something that is encouraged, that image of that could be included with the biography, or discouraged, because I know some places discourage doing that because it can maybe wear out the gravestone or something.
I think grave rubbings would be fine if the city cemetery staff disagrees.
Yeah.
I
think Congressional Cemetery in Washington, they may discourage it because they're so old and they're famous people and people do it all the time, and maybe it can have some effect when it's done thousands and thousands of times, but probably otherwise it's fine.
Well, not every tombstone in the cemetery is in great shape. The city cemetery staff, they're just some of the nicest people in the world. I've loved working with them, and they have a wealth of knowledge about the people buried here. But I know they've told me about some of the vandalism they've experienced. Some of the tombstones are broken. They also are dealing with like the ramifications of climate change and the extreme weather that Miami has to deal with. So yeah, some of the tombstones are already not in the best shape in the world. Others are in really good shape. Like the Peacock family's giant monument is in really good shape. So I think the grave rubbings would probably be fine. But if you do that and you go to the cemetery, just ask the staff first.
Wow.
When's the next time you're going to be in Miami, Bob? Do you think? Are you going to go back and visit
I
sometime
get down
soon?
there. I still have colleagues there at the University of Miami and at Rasmus at the Rosenstiel Marine Lab. So I do get down there. So yeah, no, it's one of my favorite places.
Well, if you get down in October, we're looking at tentatively an October launch to welcome the Halloween season. Paul George, the historian who's been a great mentor to us, he has a Halloween tour that he does, which is a really big hit in the cemetery. So we thought it would be a fun promotional thing for us to do too.
And you're talking about maybe spreading this to other cemeteries. How, if someone were interested in doing that, how would they proceed?
Email FCI about partnering. There are other grants we have in the works, and we could prioritize a cemetery near you if you have big interest. Sure. Are there particular interesting people that you think should really be highlighted in a local cemetery? So we're just looking to build relationships for sure.
Great. Yeah. Well, Congressional Cemetery is a national park or national monument, I guess. So that would be one. That'd be kind of cool.
Yeah, I think one thing I really love about GoBituary and why I was so excited that Anna started this project is I think it really democratizes cemetery history, because if you can't afford a tour guide, or you're coming at a, like, not a peak time where someone might be lecturing about it, the history might be kind of closed off to you. But if you're using the web app GoBituary and you're scanning QR codes next to these graves and learning about these particular people, I think it really opens up history to all of us, regardless of education or where you're coming from. If you are in the cemetery and using the web app, I think you can really dive into history in a unique way. And telling history at the level of individual lives is always very interesting to me. I remember reading history textbooks when I was a student, and getting kind of bored when we were talking about generalities, like this group of people and that group of people. It's more interesting to me to learn about the particular individuals and how they experienced life. So that's the type of history that I find fascinating. So what it was like to be an African-American incorporator of Miami and the unique struggles that person faced and their own inspirational story, it definitely makes me feel more connected to Florida in the present, for sure.
Yeah, it'd be really cool if the app had a way so when you're visiting the cemetery, you could like tap on one and you'd hear it while you're standing there, or it would give you a little tour or something like that. That would be kind of neat.
We built that in. Anna, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, we are doing recorded versions of the histories, and we're editing them so they have music and stuff in the background. But yeah, that's also something that the second thing you mentioned about making it more of like a sequential type tour is something we're interested in doing. But right now it's a little more disconnected, like you have to walk to each grave and then listen. But yes, the audio is in existence.
It's
and
like
StoryCorps.
StoryCorps.
And Spanish, yeah.
It's like StoryCorps, but for deceased people.
Yes. Yeah.
And I also, and the crowdsourcing aspect of it, I mean, the first step would be someone writing a history. And that, I think we're really pushing the definition of citizen science here. It's more on the crowdsourcing side, but we wanted to open that to everybody. But if you wrote a history and then you wanted to record your own audio, we could work with you on that. Our big focus is the launch, but we wanted to go ahead and open up the Anecdata platform because we know these things take time. And I mean, for us to write the core histories for GoBituary to start, it took us about 2 years, and they went through a number of edits. So we wanted to give people a chance to start, even if we aren't going to be ready to add them to the app necessarily right away. And so just picking someone off the list, diving into their research process, however they choose to go about it, scheduling any meetings with librarians or other experts who can help. And then we can work with them to iterate it, add audio components, all that fun stuff. But the first step is going into that Anecdata project and just picking a person and looking at our example and taking a stab at writing it.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah. So Anna, is there anything we're missing? Anything cool that we should highlight about GoBituary that we haven't covered yet?
I think you covered everything.
Angie has a question. They want to know if an obit from 1990 has already been written, yet the cause of that person's death was murder, and then they went on retrial 3 times and were proven not guilty and walked away free, even though they committed a murder. Does that person's obit deserve a rewrite? That's if they're in the cemetery and there's some level of controversy, you could put that in there. We have some controversial people spotlighted. I think oh gosh, what was his name, Anna? We just went through that history.
Of William Burdine.
Burdine, yes. So in addition to some of the African American incorporators and founders that we spotlighted, there was also a Confederate soldier spotlighted who created Miami's iconic department store, Burdine's. And I think our student historians and Anna did a good job talking about the nuances of that person's history and citing everything they did, explaining their impact on Miami, talking about how Burdine's, even though it was a landmark, discriminated against African American people, including some of the people who are also buried in the cemetery, and did sit-ins at the Burdine's lunch counter, for example. So yeah, we're not shying away from controversy. You can tell the history and contextualize it and educate us in the present.
Oh my, this could be its own podcast. The GoBituary podcast, stories of residents of the cemetery or something. And each one would be a different surprising story of some person that you found in a cemetery.
Yeah, I mean, eventually we do want to release the audio histories that we've compiled in a podcast feed too, for sure.
But that one in particular, where there was a supposed crime, and then there was a retrial and new evidence and stuff. That sounds podcasty.
Yeah, it's a serial, but for
serial, exactly. But in cemeteries. Yeah.
Jillian says, I grew up in South Florida and no idea of the history of Burdines. Jillian, sign up for the FCI newsletter, and as soon as GoBituary is released, you can read the whole history that Anna and her team wrote up. FloridaInnovation.org, that's that newsletter that you can get all the latest and greatest GoBituary updates. If there are any other questions, go ahead. For the people watching live, drop them in the chat. If you're listening to the podcast later, you can email them to us, but we really do want to answer your questions and be accessible to you. I'm trying to think of any other fun, I mean, every history that we've written has just been so much fun. Other fun anecdotes.
I have one that's kind of interesting, which was the Richard E.S. Toomey Cemetery. He wasn't from Florida originally, and in fact, at his gravestone was just like a small little marker that denoted that he was in the Spanish-American War. But he was actually a poet, and he read his book of poems called Thoughts for True Americans at the Library of Congress. So
wow.
And I think he went to Howard University. Like, he was a very accomplished person. And so they found out that it was him buried there, and now he has like a bigger headstone that lists out some of his accomplishments. But yeah, I think that's an interesting part too, is that there's a lot of people in here who have yet to be discovered in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Unsung heroes of the cemetery of this.
Exactly.
But in any cemetery, and that could almost be a challenge to find, ones that aren't necessarily prominent and ones that, don't have a lot written on them, and delve deeply enough to find what their story really was, because it could be really, really interesting.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to write a history about every single person buried. I that'd be the dream for this one, especially since it's our pilot. So that would make me really happy.
Yeah.
And I think for some of them, there's some people who maybe there isn't really data on, but we could still write about the data that we do have. Like I know some people, like maybe all we have is the cause of death from the cemetery record, but that still reveals a lot about that particular time. Like we can contextualize it in terms of like infant mortality, or like people died when I remember when Anna and Nico were going through and typing all the cause of deaths for their digitization of the cemetery records. Some of them were diseases that I didn't even recognize. So even if we don't have a record of that person from newspapers or books of poetry they wrote or things like that, we could still like contextualize them in their time. And we were also talking to a library staff member who's been a mentor to us or last week, and she was telling me about how if we really don't have any data on someone, we could talk about what their tombstone was made of. And that could reveal a lot about the time period and what resources that family might have had access to pay for that tombstone, depending on the type of stone and things like that. We have a question from Angie that came in. Angie wants to know if natural disasters occur to the deceased area, is there a plan to go and follow up on grave sites that you have already documented with this project? Yeah, I mean, I think the crowdsourcing aspect, people can explain like what condition the tombstone is in for sure. And we can definitely update the records as time goes on. Yay, I want to see if there are any other questions from folks. Get your questions in, everybody. Bob, is there anything else that comes to mind for you?
No, so I mean, there is science. So there's certainly the geology of the, where did the gravestone come from itself, and that says something about Florida geology and other things. Right, the symbols on the gravestone, if there are any, which often are not obvious but can tell a story just by themselves. Let me see. I mean, it's a little bit like finding your roots too, because each person is one node on this big family history, and that itself might be, so this person may not be that notable by themselves, but they may be the father or mother or cousin of someone else that's notable, and they may have played a part in their life. And so it's it's all these conjoining stories too.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, people can get creative with these histories for sure. And talk about how these people are connected to others. I think the genealogy librarians that people can meet with will really come in that particular aspect. And this on the topic of research, so, this is historical research and crowdsourcing that we're opening up here and building on what Anna and her team made. But we'll also at some point be evaluating GoBituary and the success of connecting people to the past and what influence it has on people in the present. So there are plans down the line to embed surveys into the web app, so we can see if GoBituary made people more likely to take part in civic actions like voting or volunteering or taking care of their neighbors, if it made them feel more connected to Miami if they are a Miamian. Or I know we have a lot of people from all over joining today. You can take those surveys too if you end up exploring GoBituary once it releases. And you can take those surveys and say if it made you feel more civically oriented or inspired, or you can also share the impact of GoBituary on you. So there's going to be some social science research embedded into it down the line for sure.
Are those big things like ancestry.com and things like that of use with this, in addition to the more local librarians and people?
Yeah, I mean, we cite and people will see that in the Julia Tuttle example that we have linked on Anecdata. We cite very broadly because this is meant to be a publicly accessible thing, and we're telling untold stories, unsung heroes. So you can get creative with the sources you cite and what you find. You just have to show your thought process and how you got there, and tell us where you found it so we can go look at it as well.
I could imagine as this grows, with more and more cemeteries, family members may be eager to tell the story of family, their ancestors or people who are buried in local cemeteries. Just as a way, because you get so little information just from a tombstone. And they have interesting and important stories to tell that family members may want to share, just from their local cemetery.
Yeah, and for our launch, we're inviting as many descendants as we can of the people buried in the cemetery. And there are some people, where we just walking through, we'll see one tombstone and the spouse has yet to be buried, for example. They still do, even though it's so historic, they still do a few new burials a year. So I think we can actively invite some of those families, and hopefully they'll take part in this crowdsourcing component too.
And they have stories. They have the stories you can't get online for, that they had this great recipe for chocolate chip cookies or cornbread or something, or they always hosted this party on the anniversary of this, things that only another loved one or relative would know or remember.
Speaking of recipes, we've seen on some tombstones, not in this cemetery, but in other cemeteries that we've looked at, sometimes people will put recipes on their tombstone.
Oh, wow.
So that's something when we expand around the country, I'm hoping, maybe we can have a cookbook or something like that. I think what sets GoBituary apart is, number one, the excellent web design from Anna and her team. You all will see it when the app comes out, the web app comes out, but the pictures, it's like, we can go back and quickly show you all. But, this picture of Alexander Lightbourne, it moves, which I think is so cool. The fact that we have the interactive quizzes that give you a score. So I think the web design is special, but also the curation, because we really want people to tell thoughtful stories, because there are websites online, which some of them are great, where you can see some information about people in different cemeteries, but we wanted to go the extra mile and really tell a story and provide that extra level of curation to it. I know we're getting close to time, so just as a reminder, if you want to participate, you can go to our SciStarter profile. So the crowdsourcing version of this is Stroll Through the Cemetery. You just pick someone from the list, and then see what sources are out there and try to tell the story as best you can. Model it after our example, but we want to keep it pretty open so you can tell the story you want to tell. And then we already answered everybody's questions. And I'll go back to, if you want to be in the loop about GoBituary's launch, whether you're in Florida or not, just go to floridainnovation.org and sign up for our newsletter. And we'll email updates about our in-person launch event coming later this fall in Miami. We'll also email everybody when the website is out. So whether you're in Iowa or Egypt or Miami, Florida, you'll be able to explore the GoBituary web app from wherever you are. I know Emma would want me to cover the upcoming events. So SciStarter Live happens every week, and it's also released on the podcast feed, thanks to Bob, our fearless podcast host. So World Mosquito Day is coming up. I know they have a SciStarter Live for that on August 20th, so sign up for that if you want to talk to NASA researchers about how you can help monitor mosquitoes and make a difference. And then August 27th, I'll be back again talking to some of my friends from the Flyways film by HHMI Tangled Bake Studios about the fall bird migration. I encourage global participation with that one because there are birds migrating all over. And you'll learn about the Flyways documentary, where you can watch it from anywhere in the world, and also bird citizen science projects that go along really nicely with that Flyways documentary, so you can make a difference for birds. And of course, it's never too early to prepare for April for Citizen Science Month. Just go ahead and mark your calendars for that. But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. Bob, Anna, any of the SciStarter folks behind the scenes, anything else you want to share before we go?
I think I'm good. Thanks a lot, Carol. And thanks, Anna, for making this amazing program.
Thank you. And thanks for having me. And thanks for Caroline. Thanks for all your support with the project.
Yay, go team. All right. Bye all. See you all sometime soon.
Right. Bye. Bye-bye.